Hello, everyone. I'm Adrienne Pilmanis, an ecologist with BLM, and I'm very pleased to be joining you at the symposium and talking to you about native plant materials and their development for restoration. Grand Staircase-Escalante ecosystems are amazing. They've been around a long time. They have their own buffering capacities and degree of resilience. Sometimes pressures from humans or natural factors will cause the need for us to step in a little bit. Several different kinds of disturbances can cause this need for us to step in and help out, or sometimes there might be some degraded habitat that needs a little bit of assistance, or perhaps we want to help strengthen the ecosystem services that these ecosystems provide. For these different kinds of projects, we usually need plant materials. So I'll speak to you today about what native plant materials are, and I'll describe the overall plant materials development process. There are things that you should think about when choosing seed sources for restoration projects. You want to be informed. And there are limited numbers of seed sources from this region. How many species do we actually want to have for native plant materials? I'll talk about that. I'll introduce the National Seed Strategy, and then I'll give you examples of how the Colorado Plateau Native Plant Program is increasing seed sources for this region and give you some ideas of how you can get involved. Most of the native plant materials used in restoration projects are seed, and that is what I'll talk about mostly today. But also, native plant materials are seedlings, cuttings, and other kinds of propagules. For example, nursery pots, willow cuttings, and moss cookies. These are all produced by an industry of farms and nurseries. You can certainly go out and collect materials for restoration projects on your own, but it's generally easier, faster, and more affordable to purchase from industry. The plant materials development process is driven by the need for materials to do restoration projects. To get materials developed, you need a lot of seed collected from wildland species, a lot of species and a lot of populations. Once you have those in hand, you can then trial those in agronomic settings, see if they can be produced by farmers. You can compare how they perform against materials that are already on the market. You can analyze their genetics, and you can also subject them to extreme situations like drought or temperature extremes. Once you have materials that perform fairly well, you want to go ahead and increase them some more, and you can use them in some more realistic seeding trials with seed mixes. Once there's material that everyone is very much happy with, a plant materials center will probably establish a foundation seed field that commercial growers will get their seed from to produce. Also, probably there will be an official plant material document released. At this point, whenever the seed is grown, your state crop association will usually be able to inspect it and certify it with tags that say, yes, this germplasm is what we say it is and it's dependable. Those tags might be for the foundation seed or source identified seed or other. Certification tags can also be given to just bags of wildland collected seed. Some species, like shrubs, don't lend themselves to increase in an agronomic setting well. All right, once a producer has grown a lot of seed, they need to harvest it, and then there's a lot of processing. You need to separate the wheat from the chaff after it's dried out. You may need to send the seed through a lot of steps for a cleaning process. Once all that seed is cleaned, you can sample some of it, send it to your state seed lab for testing of viability, purity, and contamination. You'll get seed test results that you will then be able to send with all of your bagged seed to seed warehouses and seed distributors. This is where people will order the seed from for their restoration projects. And that's an important kind of seed storage that needs to be climate controlled. Another kind of seed storage is long-term seed banks. Oftentimes, this is where some of the wildland collected seed will go to directly. USDA has long-term storage seed banks across the country, like this one in Fort Collins, which has seed stored in liquid nitrogen. Also, the wildland seed that is collected in bag will also go and be stored in seed warehouses. Now, once you have all these different kinds of seed in the seed warehouses, before you do a restoration project, you're going to need to mix it together into the seed mix that's needed for that particular site. And this too can require some interesting equipment and processing, but eventually, once you get the seed sources mixed together, then you're ready to go and take it out to the restoration project. You might need a special seeder, like this Truax seeder, which can direct different size seeds into different depths in the soil, or you might use a helicopter for less impactful seeding. But then eventually, boom, you've got your new system beautifully restored, we hope. I mentioned plant material documentation in the last slide. Most of these are from USDA entities, and you can find them at this website at NRCS, Plant Materials Technical Publication. They vary. The original plant release might be something that looks like this one for Salata alkali sacchaton. It was released back a couple of decades ago, and it tells you all about where the seed was collected, whether or not it was bred, and what NRCS recommends it be used for. There are some species for which no named plant material is on the market, but which plant material centers have worked with, like small leaf globe mallow. In this case, they have plant guides out, which give some general species-related information, which is also very helpful, just there is no particular named plant material out there. Some species, like blue grama, are important, and there are several named plant materials released for them. So in this case, NRCS puts out plant fact sheets and gives you some suggestions for uses, establishment, management, and describes the different plant materials, named plant materials that are available. When choosing a seed source for a restoration project, first, make sure it's native, at least from this continent, if not somewhere closer to home. Why does that matter? Well, because even though a species can have a very large range, different subpopulations in the species may be adapted to different environmental gradients and pressures, and those adaptations may show up in subpopulation differences. For example, look at this planting of several blue bunch, wheatgrass, wildland seed sources from different places, and there's a few official plant materials releases thrown in. You can see a wide variation in how those populations are looking, growing right there next to each other. And that's because of those subpopulation differences or breeding of the plant materials over time. Is your plant seed source, is it genetically diverse? For one thing, was it bred for specific traits, like one of the older cultivars? That would be called being bred in the manipulated track versus natural track. Manipulated means it's been undergoing selective breeding for traits that generally make it easier to harvest and farm. The different kind of certification tags that are given to these bags of seed are clues to what kind of a seed source something is. Foundation seed this is the breeder seed, but it's for a non-native species. It's a different color from certified seed of Basin wild rye, which is a native species, but has been highly selected. And so these are manipulated track certification tags, whereas the blue, green, and orange are natural track certification tags for materials that came straight from wildland, but maybe were evaluated a little bit or tested a little bit. And those are less likely to have significant diversity loss than seed sources where there's been a lot of breeding. Sometimes nowadays you can actually determine if your seed source has had molecular genetic diversity analyzed. It's a lot less expensive now than it used to be. What seed sources are from this region? Not very many. This map shows the source origin locations of all of the commercially available plant materials that my program could find. Some materials aren't from one origin, and those are kind of listed down in the box at the left-hand corner. But if you look at the Grand Staircase-Escalante region, you'll notice you don't see a lot of dots in that area. In fact, if you look at areas that we know are warmer and drier, you will see that there aren't a lot of commercial plant materials available for those. That's an artifact of the Department of Agriculture primarily developing plant materials for farmers to use for pastures and for crops. Okay, in Utah, seed mixes tend to draw from about 80 native species and 30 non-native species available on the market. Obviously, most of those are not from anywhere near Utah. If you look at the state, you can see maybe 13 dots for different plant materials in Utah. some grasses, forbs, one shrub, and then also some of the multiple sources are partially sourced in Utah. If you look at the Staircase region, you'll notice maybe 4 dots. And that's because there just aren't many plant materials commercially available for that region. And of those 4, really only Palmer's penstemon is reliably available on the commercial market. You can find some more of these helpful seed source maps with a lot of information on them, like seed transfer zones and the entity that put out the plant material on our Colorado Plateau Native Plant Program website. And if you want to do some research about the particular species in question, use the USDA plants database that has links to plant materials and guides. How many seed sources do we need per species and which ones do we use? Challenging, depends on many factors. For species like Indian ricegrass, which is spread across the continent and is wind pollinated, you might need a lot of sources. How are you going to know? What tool can you use to tell how many sources you're going to need for any particular source, and to know whether or not you can collect a source in Utah and use it in Arizona? Well, you can use seed transfer zones. They're scientifically derived and they help you know how far you can move a seed source for restoration. Seed transfer zones are one of the best tools available now that can guide us on where it's acceptable to use seeds that are sourced from a particular location. One that applies to every species is called provisional seed transfer zones, and these are applicable across the country. They're based on climate and major landforms, so you can use those for any species if you don't have a better tool. There are also species-specific provisional seed transfer zones that include a species distribution model, and they may use different climate-weighted variables depending on the species. These give a better inference of adaptation of the species to the environment. And for example, here you could take some Bootaloo gracilis seed from northwestern Arizona and probably use it with good success in the Staircase-Escalante region. There are better seed transfer zones available that were made with genetic analysis of materials from across a species range. So they give better inference of adaptation and heredity. This map is for hoary tansy aster, and it looks like we could probably be successful with restoration projects with just 2 sources in the Grand Staircase-Escalante region. The gold standard is empirical seed transfer zones, and these require having common garden studies at a lot of different sites, studying populations from all over the range at a lot of different environmental characteristics. We only have one that's applicable to the Staircase region, and that is for Indian ricegrass. We're still trying to answer the question about how many seed sources we should have when we're developing plant materials. Well, science of seed transfer zones says get 1 source for each species per zone. Oh, great, we're going to need a lot more seed sources available commercially than we have now. In the Staircase, we need almost any seed sources for restoration. How can we make this happen? And again, we could collect individually on a project-by-project basis, but if we can collaborate with others strategically on a much larger scale, we might be able to gradually bring more and more priority plant material sources to the market that we need. There is a national effort in progress to make this happen. It's called the National Seed Strategy. The vision is getting the right seed at the right place at the right time, and the mission is to ensure the availability of genetically appropriate seed reserves to restore viable and productive plant communities and sustainable ecosystems. It's an exciting goal. There's a lot of content about this strategy, and I recommend you go ahead and check it out and read about it. There are numerous federal and non-federal entities that are signatories in the National Seed Strategy, and together they've determined that success looks like nationwide networks of people working together to collect seed, to identify and develop the appropriate seed, to farm it, to grow it, to test it, to certify it, store it and supply it, and then put it in the right place at the right time. I'd like to recognize some pretty impressive accomplishments of 20 years of Seeds of Success wildland native seed collections, which are greatly increasing our ability to develop native plant material sources. They're providing the raw materials. There have been 26,000 collections nationwide over hundreds of species, and some of each of those collections is stored at long-term seed bank conservation areas, while other parts of those collections go into trials, research, and increase. In the Colorado Plateau region, we've made about 4,000 collections of about 100 species, and we keep some parts of our collections at a working seed bank, USGS in Flagstaff in freezing, and from there we direct it out to genetics, common gardens, network trials, and increase. We are increasing seed sources for this region using BLM contracts and agreements in a few ways. We're increasing some of those natural track single seed sources that our partners have been trialing for years, comparing them with older sources, and we're keeping the ones that perform better than the old sources or are good for different sites or fill seed zone gaps. And some of those should be available in a couple years. In fact, 3 of them just had plant materials releases documents come out: Macedona, Ouray Indian ricegrass, Chipeta Indian ricegrass. We're also taking wildland seed collections from SOS directly, putting those in BLM contracts, pooled sources by seed transfer zone, sending them to growers and getting those produced. That seed will end up in the BLM seed warehouse in 3 to 4 years, and then shortly after that we'll get onto the commercial market. We're focusing on forbs and some warm seeds and grasses that we need for restoration. We're doing this also with some small growers with some challenging species like milkweed. Rim-to-rim restoration is in Moab. And then for species which are challenging, they're always small collections in our SOS collections. First, we send them to an evaluation partner to increase a little bit before we can send them to a large grower to grow for contract. And those important partners are Los Lunas Plant Materials Center, Upper Colorado Environmental Plant Center, and the Utah Department of Wildlife Resources. In 2021 altogether, we produced 2,800 pounds of 15 seed sources. In 2022, we'll be adding 10 new sources. So pretty soon, you should be seeing more choices in terms of commercial availability of native plant materials for this region. So you can get involved in native plant materials development and restoration in several ways. First of all, you want to be educated about your native species and plant materials. Secondly, there are efforts you can get tied into, like the Colorado Plateau Native Plant Program. This is a voluntary partnership. It's informal, and we have federal, state, and local entity members, tribes, non-governmental organizations, seed and nursery companies, and researchers from different universities. It's part of BLM's Plant Conservation and Restoration Program. We are seeking partners to help host common garden and seeding trial experimental sites for a regional network. If you're interested in that, please get in touch with me. Another group you can get tied in with is the Plant Conservation Alliance. It's national, and it has several different kinds of listservs and distributes a lot of information. There is in our region a DNA, Native Plant Materials Program, a Native Plants Conservation Program. It's fairly new, but you can get in touch with them. Oh, you can also evaluate, trial, and increase seed and plants on your own if you're capable and interested in doing that, or join with some other kind of organization locally. You can always give input to land management plans that are happening in your area and the entities managing your lands. Speak with your elected representatives. Tell them that you want to support native plant materials development with adequate funding. And you can communicate what you learn to others by presenting at schools or other community groups. And you can certainly establish demonstration gardens. Those are a great way to expose people to different native plant materials and native species. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Feel free to contact me at apilmani@blm.gov, and I look forward to answering questions in the panel discussion.